Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, November the 17th. After the briefing war, the lobbying row and Friday's market fright at a budget U-turn, surely this week has to be better than last week. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy of Politico. Today, Keir Starmer is looking to Shabana Mahmood to get things back on track. The Home Office describing its overhaul of the asylum system today as the most sweeping reforms to tackle illegal migration in modern times. So Britain is ripping up the post-war refugee settlement and turning to Denmark for inspiration, where asylum claims have dropped to a 40-year low and where 95% of all rejected asylum seekers are deported. But will Labour swallow it?
Because the question, Anne, of what Labour do and don't swallow, as in so much else besides at the moment, is front and centre of our politics. Just before we dive straight into the main stories, a couple of other things to stick on your agenda, but they all are along this theme. I do wonder whether the wider Labour Party, particularly its councillors, will be particularly happy with the story in the Times this morning that councils will be prevented from refusing planning permission for housing projects of more than 150 homes. Will have to refer applications to the government for a decision. Right. So at the moment, the law only requires councils to refer large-scale developments that breach national planning guidance. But in future, everything has to go to the government, which is a big stripping of the power of local authorities and of councillors, a move against local democracy. So I think there's an interesting question there of whether Labour will wear that.
It's quite a lot of questions this morning about what the Labour Party will put up with. One story that caught my eye in the FT, Sam, is that the party itself, institutionally, has been holding a series of drinks receptions sponsored by private companies, claiming it doesn't need to declare them to the Electoral Commission because they are, quotes, commercial partnerships purchased on a standard commercial basis, quote ends. So that's making the Labour Party sound a bit, I don't know, commercial. Anyway, it's the same clause that means it doesn't have to declare to the watchdog things like stands at party conference and the like. But you could say this may have taken the exemption too far. The FT saying since last July, it has organised at least 7 social functions, which with companies including MasterCard and the house builder Vistry, attended by MPs and ministers. Let's watch where that goes.
Yeah, it's a great story by Jen Williams of the Financial Times. Why wouldn't you have to declare, commercial sponsorship for events? That seems sort of just not to pass the sniff test. And I know people inside Labour and people who used to work inside Labour who know these rules incredibly well, that says the party's been flying very close to the line on this kind of thing. So I won't be surprised if this comes back to bite them. And a bit of Westminster village housekeeping. Former spinner to Pat McFadden and former Daily Mirror political editor John Stevens is joining Number 10 as new head of comms day to day. That is the scoop in Politico Playbook this morning, and he starts at once. Right, let's get on to the main business, which is a smorgasbord, word of the week, of the aftermath of the kind of incredible events of last Friday with what the government wants to reset us with today. Keir Starmer might have entered Downing Street promising country before party, but after last week's utter shambles, it's his MPs who hold the PM's fate in their hand. And that shambles and played out in public on Friday in one of the most gruesome episodes of politics that I can remember, because it was so high wire and just saw the clash of markets, government and politics all happening and playing out through the day.
Well, let's recap as we look into a week of post-traumatic grief stress in the government. The Chancellor had decided against raising income tax, the measure she had been pitch rolling so assiduously for the previous fortnight, keeping us in conversation to have on the podcast and elsewhere. On Friday, we were told the latest round of slightly improved economic forecasts allowed her greater room for manoeuvre, meaning a black hole of closer to £20 billion than £30 billion would be filled in the budget, although in fact that 20 billion reduction had already been sketched out by a lot of analysts and some former chancellors, so maybe it wasn't quite such a surprise. Anyway, it meant that she would be able to avoid being the first Chancellor since 1975 to raise income tax and would instead rely on a smorgasbord of other changes to fill the black hole, though it doesn't sound like a very tempting spread, that one. Sam?
No, and I think what happened on Friday has enduring political significance, not least for the lessons that the markets took away from that. As you just touched on, the Treasury says that the decision to take an income tax rise off the table was because of improved economic forecasts, higher wage growth and higher tax receipts. But as you just pointed out, Anne, we knew that was coming. We said it on this podcast as long ago as 2 weeks ago. Look out, higher wage growth is going to offset the productivity downgrade that the Office of Budget Responsibility is promising. And it's not just because the markets listen to this podcast, because the markets do their own homework. They knew that too. And that's why they didn't really entirely buy the explanation of the government. This is the important bit. They are also aware, just as we are, that there is politics in this. They smell the politics like we all do. You know, there were comments by the new Labour Deputy Leader, Lucy Powell, about not breaking manifesto pledges on tax. There were comments on Wednesday morning by Wes Streeting when he was in that sort of quite toxic morning round of interviews after the attack by allies of Keir Starmer. And he said parties shouldn't break their promises then. That was something that struck an alarm bell, but I didn't quite foresee where that was going. Big figures coming out and saying you mustn't break promises. It is, and it smells and it feels like there was such a big backlash to the idea that they'd raise income tax that they decided to pull back. But this is what worries the market. The conclusions of the Chancellor seem to be that she cannot raise income tax now in this budget, in part for political reasons. And if that is the case, she is in a yet further straitjacket forever, because there will never be a point in this parliament where it's easier to do it than now. I'm not saying it is easy, but I'm just saying it will never be easier than it is now. It's going to get more difficult as you get closer to an election. So in effect, what they think happened on Friday is that Rachel Reeves took a massive lever that she had been contemplating pulling and put it beyond reach for the whole of the rest of the parliament. And that is just doubling down on the straitjacket. And that's the thing that really worried everybody in the markets.
The problem with this narrative, as you suggest, if we're heading into what the government would dearly love to be calm down week, pranayama breathing all around the cabinet table and the like, is the markets have started jumping in different directions when Rachel Reeves makes decisions, because they're just so uncertain of where she's headed. And it's not clear that that is going to change for the reason perhaps that you've just put your finger on, that a massive lever that a Chancellor signalled that she was going to use. She then decided, after all, that she wasn't going to do that. So whereas she benefited, Sam, from the bond markets essentially signalling in July in the welfare debacle and that big retreat, which I think has fundamentally defined her chancellorship, and not in a good way, is that they were happier nonetheless with her in post than anyone else who might come in. They thought would be more left-leaning and would raise taxes. Well, now they seem to have come to the conclusion that if Rachel Reeves isn't going to raise taxes, that they're not very happy with that either, because if you don't have growth and you don't have anything else going on, well, on the whole, you might as well have the income, because at least it can be predicted accurately. Remember that markets in this sense are not strictly rational. They are responsive and they're predictive. So what we saw was that it was the yield, in effect, the interest rate on 10-year government bonds jumping to the highest level in a month at the end of the week. And it will be very interesting to see where that goes. Does the market accept this calm down narrative, or do they see every reason not to be calm at all?
Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves's fate lie in the hands of Labour MPs and the market. So we have to analyse both quite closely. And there is if you could indulge me to explain, there is another element of how the markets see this, another element of why they're worried, which will help determine their reactions after this budget to what Rachel Reeves announces. So instead of a raise of income taxes, there's going to be this so-called smorgasbord of other tax rises. So a new tax on electric vehicles, salary fat sacrifice schemes are going to be themselves sacrificed, freezing tax thresholds, which, by the way, Rachel Reeves said a year ago would break manifesto promises. Nevertheless, for a market worried about the scale of government borrowing, what she's proposing now, this smorgasbord, is inherently a lot less reliable and a lot less stable. If she raised income tax, then the markets would know that a lot of extra revenue was automatically guaranteed to flow into the Treasury coffers in the near term. So there's no question that she'd hit her self-imposed borrowing limits. But now there is a lot more jeopardy, a lot more uncertainty in the announcement she will make on budget day. For instance, will the electric vehicles tax actually go ahead, or will Labour MPs take part in a green backlash? If most of the revenue raising measures are due to hit towards the end of the Parliament, but markets know that you'll be heading into an election, then won't they be watered down before they're absolutely definitely implemented? All of those things have started to spook the markets as well, and that's why I think you saw an adjustment in the price price of borrowing that you referenced.
There's only one more possible tax that could be part of that buffet that you were referring to. An idea examined but junked a year ago, back on the agenda, according to the Times. Mayors would be able to levy a tax on people staying overnight in their area. So, an inhospitable hospitality tax, something Steve Rotherham in Liverpool was pushing for instance. But the industry, the hospitality industry, that is, worries it could cost $500 million a year. The impact on Brits taking domestic breaks would be substantial. Of course, also at a time when hospitality is generally suffering and the price of foodstuffs and staffing, etc., is rising. That would be definitely a two-edged sword.
Yeah, no, this is totally a great example of exactly what we're talking about. A measure that's a sort of small to medium-sized revenue raiser is going to cause massive disproportionate pain in a particular sector and particular political backlash. Not least, Anne, because government ministers promised as recently as September, which isn't that long ago, can you believe it, in writing and in the Commons, that they weren't going to do this. On September the 3rd, the then tourism minister, it was at that point Chris Bryant, went out of his way to tell the Commons that there were no plans for a tourist tax, and another minister put that in writing. So the sector can legitimately sort of feel very, very grumpy about this, and there's the danger of the smorgasbord, very, very grumpy sections of society, even if they didn't get an income tax rise. So the question of whether the political backlash could put the plan in jeopardy, again, that's the question that the markets have.
Metaphor alert, we get to discuss whether there's a hospitality tax on the smorgasbord.
Quick, change the subject.
Okay. It's early. Let's turn to the thing the government wants to talk about today. If you want to know how to do an effective briefing operation, then the Home Office has definitely bested the rest. Stories preparing for today's Asylum announcement in the papers, splashed across all media as well, every day since Friday. Now, Shabana Mahmood's aim is to deal with three problems, I would say, in our immigration and asylum system. The first is that under her analysis, we are simply too generous as a country to people coming here. The second is once you're here, it's too easy to stay and too hard to remove you if you don't have the legitimacy to be here. And third, that the criteria for these two decisions is way too woolly and allows too much legal recourse, which stops politicians being able to effectively has taken away control of the asylum system and undermined it in a lot of people's eyes. It's a very different order of arguments to those raised previously by Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, and she was Home Secretary, which was basically, Sam, an analysis that the system just needed to get more efficient. The Conservatives hadn't run it properly, hadn't invested in it. But Shabana Mahmood is saying the system can't be made better until the rules are changed and tightened.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of much more effective communication here. I do see the outline of quite a lot of the plans that Yvette Cooper put in place before she was involuntarily removed from the Home Office, however. So what actually is the difference here beyond the tone and tenor of the briefing is something I've still got to get my head around, not least because I don't think the current team particularly want us to be drawing comparisons, so they're making that quite hard. Let's just tell you what the plans are. First of all, the weekend briefings were about how they're going to address, as you were saying, the incentives, the pull factors, getting why people are choosing Britain above other countries. And the big thing they're going to change is refugee status. They're going to turn that into something temporary rather than permanent. So once you're granted right to stay as a refugee, you'll find that it's reviewed every 30 months. And it will then take not 5, but 20 years to get indefinite leave to remain, which is the highest in Europe, we're told, with the next highest being the Danes on 8 years. As well as that, ending automatic family reunion, which was something that was paused, that will now be made permanent.
The bulk of the announcements today are about how to speed up returns. There's quite a lot in Playbook from Politico this morning about how a law would then deal with a new definition of what the ECHR deems the right to family life and the right to privacy, and what that means in practice. The intention of the shift, or the shift in interpretation, rather tortuously, I think, that the government is going to try to make, is so that they can deport foreign criminals more easily. That will be the claim. There will be a new one-stop shop, a legal body that allows one route to appeal, a single one only. But the details of this are pretty sketchy, and ultimately cases could still go back to the traditional courts. But again, this is modelled on an approach in Denmark, which basically tried to narrow in the number of routes to appeal. So you can expect massive pushback there from the old human rights law industry, from which one Keir Starmer hails. So it appears to be a very different Keir Starmer to the one who was once a human rights lawyer.
And the final bit is they've started putting countries on notice that if they don't take back refugees, then they may have their visa rights, citizens and others may have their visa rights curtailed. So Angola, Namibia and the Democratic Republic of Congo could face basically a sliding scale of punishments, beginning with imposing penalties on diplomats and VIPs who lose priority access, and then a sort of sliding scale to not granting visas to people from that country. I would argue it's fairly easy to target people from those countries. There's a naughty list that aren't likely to get sanctions immediately, but are being watched. That includes India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Far more difficult to do stuff to those countries. But finally, part of this message has to be aimed at Labour MPs. Again, we are back to the theme of this podcast, which is so much comes down to the requirement of the Prime Minister now to get the consent of his party, which is harder than it should be for somebody with a landslide majority. And there are MPs across the political spectrum worried that this is all too harsh. On the left, who they just dislike all of this. On the right, some of them who regard themselves as liberal and pro-immigration. So for that section of the community, the messaging is, look, we do all of this, we create the political space for more safe and legal routes to the UK, a sponsorship route like the one modelled on Homes for Ukraine, a route for refugee students modelled on the one for students from Gaza, and a route for skilled refugees. So, Anne, taking the whole thing in totality, what do you make of this package?
Well, I think what you read from that, and also that attempt perhaps to offset it and saying, okay, here are some groups that a lot of people in the Labour Party and beyond, target voters, would like to see Britain uphold, is some sense of openness and opening our doors to those who are in genuine distress and need. But I think what we're going to see is that is going to be corralled to a much smaller potential group of people, and that it's going to be sort of named countries or named groups of people in a retreat really from the universality of the view of asylum and refugee definitions of refugees who are deemed to be welcome or able indeed to get into the UK. And the noticeable thing about Mahmoodism on all of this, Sam, is that she's been absolutely clear over the last couple of days on the need to reduce overall numbers of people successfully claiming asylum and the conditions in which they're able to do that, as well as her attack on irregular migration, which she says is bringing the entire system into disrepute. It's such a long way from arguments I heard people, including around the cabinet table, make for a lot of years, saying these are desperate people. We cannot blame them for trying to come into Britain by any means. You would do the same if you were coming from some war-torn country or you had no dignified future. The methodology now is much more similar, to my mind, to the hostile environment definition, which you'll remember Theresa May embraced from about 2012 onwards, when she was imposed as Home Secretary, which then became a big talking point and backfired on her over the Windrush scandal. But this idea that you just don't make the UK as attractive is fundamentally at the core of what Mahmood wants. Now, is that something that she can carry off with MPs? Will they follow her logic that if you don't do this, you will have an even further lurch to the right and an even tougher clampdown on people coming into the country? Or will people simply say, well, this is a bit like, to save the village, you had to destroy it? We are looking too much like Nigel Farage, too much like Reform Light.
You can see Shabana Mahmood's argument in The Guardian. Dark forces are stirring up anger in this country and seeking to turn that anger into hate. We must take the opportunity we have to stop that from happening. But this is going to be a lengthy argument over many months. So we will see how that plays out. Today is only the first salvo. Rumours in The Guardian that there could be a ministerial resignation over all of this. Let's look at where the anger coalesces. That's it. We've hit our 20-minute time limit, and we are not overstayers on this podcast, are we, Anne? So we will wrap it up there, and we'll be back for Tuesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's.
See you tomorrow, Sam.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.